We're also joined today by two people with lived experience in immigration detention, Mr. Abdelrahman Elmady and Ms. Sara Maria Gomez, who are our campaign champions. Both came to Canada hoping to receive protection, but were met instead with a horrible introduction to this country. Before I hand it over to my colleagues, I'd like to say a few words. We've come to Parliament Hill today to urge Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to get Canada on the path of abolishing immigration detention. As a first step, Canada should end the practice of incarcerating migrants and asylum seekers in provincial jails on immigration grounds. Over the past decade, Canada has incarcerated tens of thousands of people in immigration detention, including children and people who are seeking safety, people for whom Canada represents hope and a home. According to our research, many are forced to endure some of the most restrictive jail conditions in Canada, including maximum security provincial jails, and without even knowing when they will be released. And how is it possible that people can be detained without end in sight? Canada is one of the only countries in the global north without a legislative time limit on the duration of immigration detention. Not only are these violations of international human rights standards, but they also have devastating effects on people's mental health. I want to step back and provide some details around the legal framework that makes these violations possible on such a wide scale. First, immigration detention is administrative. This means that people incarcerated in the system are not held on criminal charges or convictions. In the vast majority of cases, people are held in immigration detention for flight risk, meaning that a border agency officer is claiming that the individual in question may not appear for an immigration or refugee proceeding. This does not necessarily mean that the person has already failed to appear in the past or made any indication that they would not appear in the future. The Canada Border Services Agency may also detain individuals if they are not satisfied with their identity documents or for the purposes of an examination. Between 2016 and 2020, these two grounds of detention represented 94% of cases. One of the CBSA's most consequential powers within the immigration detention system is that the agency has full authority over where people are detained. Every year, hundreds of migrants and asylum seekers are incarcerated on purely immigration grounds in maximum security provincial jails. Our research found that immigration detainees with mental health conditions face discrimination throughout the detention process. According to CBSA policy, the agency may incarcerate people with mental health conditions in provincial jails specifically because of their mental health condition. CBSA representatives justified this practice by claiming that people have access to specialized care in provincial jails and that their behavior can be better managed in those facilities. Instead of receiving vital support, people with psychosocial disabilities are subjected to disproportionately coercive treatments in immigration detention. But the news is not all bad. A year ago, we launched our Welcome to Canada campaign, which targets the practice of using provincial jails for immigration detention in Canada. And we've had success. In the last few months alone, 4 provinces have cancelled with their contracts with CBSA that allowed their jails to be used to incarcerate immigration detainees. In doing so, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Alberta, and Manitoba have ended their complicity in the federal immigration detention system, a system that stands in stark contrast to the image many Canadians and people have of Canada from around the world as a welcoming and multicultural safe haven. There is a wealth of community-based organizations that provide tailored and compassionate support to newcomers. But migrants and refugee claimants cannot access these services while they are in jail. Instead, many people have begun their lives in Canada with a traumatic introduction. The devastating impact of immigration detention can last for years after people are freed, and the consequences can seep into the fabric of marginalized communities. With 4 provinces now having cancelled their immigration detention contracts with the federal government, it's past time for Prime Minister Trudeau to finally listen and demonstrate the leadership needed to end this devastating practice once and for all. With that, I'm pleased to introduce to you Abdelrahman Elmady and Sara Maria Lopez Gomez, who will each say a few words about their journeys. They have both traveled from afar, in more ways than one, to be here with us today, and we are grateful for their courage and persistence for justice. Thank you, Abdelrahman, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Abdelrahman Elmady. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you my personal experience in immigration detention. I arrived in Canada in 2017 to seek refugee protection. I fled from Egypt because, as a human rights activist, my life was in danger. When I landed at Vancouver International Airport, I was filled with hope and anticipation. I know Canada was a country that stands for human rights and freedom. And I feel deep in my bones that I would finally be at home and safe. But instead of freedom, I was handcuffed and arrested without search. My belongings were taken away, including my rechargeable batteries to my hearing aid. I have hearing disability. I depend on hearing aids. Without them, I am in complete silence. Within hours of arriving in Canada, I was in jail. I was confused and scared. I had to try navigating through jail with a language barrier. And I could not hear anyone or anything. I didn't know why I was arrested and detained. I didn't know why I was put in handcuffs. I didn't know why I was in jail. I didn't know how long I would be there. I didn't know who I could ask these basic questions. I didn't know who I could trust. I spent my first night in Vancouver, in the Vancouver jail. And my faith in Canada was violently shattered. And I was alone in jail and in silence. This will always be my introduction to Canada. I spent the following 2 months in jails in 3 jails in BC, and I never know when I would be released. I spent most of my time in jail in silence because I was only provided with one hearing aid at a time and only for the CBSA meetings and hearings. The batteries would run out after a few hours. I was repeatedly handcuffed and strip searched. This was absolutely humiliating and terrifying, and I had no idea why I was there. I just cried. Once I was released and got a work permit, I started working very hard, trying to forget. This is something wrong with this system. There's something wrong with this system. But this is a beautiful country. Day by day, I try to move forward and heal. And I have come to feel that this is my home. This is the first time I truly feel at home. But I continue to live separate from my wife and children who are in Egypt. I miss them with all my heart. For most of my time, I could only dream of human rights. When BC decided, in the name of human rights, to stop jailing immigration detainees, this feels like a major achievement. When Nova Scotia, Alberta, and Manitoba joined in, I was overjoyed. It gives me hope for the rest of Canada as well. I hope that the federal government will stop this practice across the country. And I hope that other people coming to this country will receive a more humane and compassionate welcome. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sara Maria Gomez Lopez. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today about my beginnings in Canada. I arrived in Canada in 2012 to seek asylum. In the past 10 years, I experienced the best of what Canada has to offer, but I also experienced the worst of what authorities try to hide. In 2012, I was staying at a welcome center in Vancouver when CBSA officers came to see me. They asked me to step outside and arrested me as soon as my feet were off the premises. I spent a single day of freedom as a refugee claimant. Before I was placed in immigration detention. The CBSA officer handling my case was aggressive. He said, "Get ready to be deported," because Canada deports 98% of Mexicans. He decided I did not deserve protection before ever hearing my story. My refugee claim was eventually approved, and today I live and work in Vancouver. I never understood why CBSA arrested me. I never understood why CBSA incarcerated me in the Lloyd Correctional Center, a maximum security provincial jail. No one explained me the rules, and there was not interpretation support in jail. I was expected to automatically know and abide by the rules or risk punishment. I turned into an inmate, a number, a faceless nobody. I remained in immigration detention for 3 months. A few months after I was released from jail, a woman named Lucia Vega Jimenez took her life in immigration detention. She was from Mexico, like me. She also spent part of her detention at the Lloyd jail. Behind those walls, I came close to losing my hope, but I held on. Lucia was not as lucky. And it hurts to think about how many others lose their hope, their faith in Canada, and even their lives because of immigration detention. When I heard about BC's decision in July to stop jailing immigration detainees, I was overjoyed. It felt like one of the most difficult chapters in my life finally closed. I thought about Lucia. I thought about my cellmates who were with me in immigration detention. And I thought about all the people that will never build jail in BC, simply forsaking safety or a better life in this country. Shortly after BC's decision, Nova Scotia, Alberta, and Manitoba followed suit. These are huge victories for human rights. A decade has passed since I experienced human rights violations in Canada. And finally, we were heard as a part of the justice that everyone deserves. I hope the federal government will stop this harmful practice across the country. And finally, give way to the humane welcome that has helped heal so many who found refuge in this country. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Allan, and I'm here to support the proposals being made by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International jointly, asking that the practices we are hearing about this morning be brought to an end. The shocking experiences that we've just heard about from both Sara and Abdelrahman are not isolated examples. In fact, they're chilling evidence of practices that over the last 10 years have resulted in the cruel and inappropriate detention of tens of thousands of men and women and children in Canada. These are people who came to our borders as migrants, as asylum seekers, and by asking for admission to Canada, they sought safe refuge, they sought the chance for a better life. Au lieu d'être accueillis et traités avec dignité et respect, comme vous l'avez entendu ce matin, ils ont été menottés, enchaînés et incarcérés dans des prisons provinciales pour des périodes indéterminées afin d'être logés avec des personnes accusées ou reconnues coupables de crimes. Instead of being welcomed and treated with dignity and respect, they were handcuffed without charge and thrown into provincial jails for indefinite periods to be housed with those accused of and convicted of crime. And who are the people detained so unjustly in our name? Well, as we've heard this morning, they include families and children, refugee claimants fleeing traumatic experiences and persecution, persons struggling with mental health challenges. Many of them endured the most restrictive forms of incarceration in the country, including maximum security jails and solitary confinement. It's important to stress that there are no laws or regulations governing when and under what circumstances an immigration detainee can be transferred to and incarcerated in a provincial jail. Rather, these vital decisions regarding immigration detainees' residual liberty rights are entirely within the broad discretion of the Canadian Border Services Agency, which remains the only major law enforcement agency in Canada without independent civilian oversight. The landmark report published last year by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International called on authorities to acknowledge and address allegations of systemic racism within CBSA and the immigration detention system. The report raises serious concerns about the fact that immigration detainees from racialized communities, and in particular Black men, are confined in more restrictive conditions and for more prolonged periods of time. Because there are no legal time limits on immigration detention, detainees may languish in jail for months or for years. So how could such things happen in Canada? How could our border practices stray so far from our vaunted ideals and from our self-image as a country of refuge, from our professed commitment to due process and the guarantees contained in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Well, because the border agency has too much unbridled authority and too little public accountability. Because we have tacitly allowed unjustified fears about public security to override our respect for human rights. Because the prevailing mentality at the point of entry seems to be that migrants and asylum seekers are threats to be feared and controlled, rather than human beings to be welcomed and respected. As a result, too many migrants and asylum seekers are detained pending the determination of their legal status, and too many of them are locked up in places meant to punish and deter, even though none of them are being held on criminal charges. Well, the facts are now out. The stories are public. The record is there for all to see. And the question now is, what are we going to do about it? 4 gouvernements provinciaux ont déjà pris leurs décisions. La Colombie-Britannique, l'Alberta, le Manitoba et la Nouvelle-Écosse ont mis fin à leurs accords avec Ottawa pour permettre que leurs prisons provinciales soient utilisées pour la détention des immigrants. D'autres gouvernements provinciaux sont en train de reconsidérer leur position là-dessus. 4 provincial governments have already made their decision. British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and Nova Scotia have ended their agreements with Ottawa, which allowed their provincial jails to be used for immigration detention. Other provincial governments are reconsidering their position. But border control is in the jurisdiction of the federal government. It's therefore fundamentally an issue over which Ottawa should take control and show leadership. If it chose to do so, the Government of Canada could today, with the stroke of a pen, put an end to this practice. And so we come to this place today with simple questions seeking straight answers. When will the Government of Canada put an end to the odious practice of jailing migrants and asylum seekers? Must we wait until all the remaining provinces have ripped up the jail agreements? Or will the Government of Canada get out in front, go back to first principles, and declare once and for all that Canada will not jail migrants and asylum seekers pending the determination of their legal status? We will continue to press for answers to those questions. Those who have been victimized by this appalling practice deserve no less.
Next, we have the Honorable Lloyd Axworthy.
Well, thank you very much. And I welcome the chance to make a comment on the presentations that have been heard. I want to first pay tribute to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty for having put together the serious ground of evidence that is an indictment of the Canadian commitment to human rights. And I think that is a point I want to make, that this abrogation of rights that actually the right of asylum goes back into ancient times, Greek, Roman cities, Middle Eastern cities. It's been completely codified by the Declaration of Human Rights, by the Refugee Convention, by our own Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it's I think, both surprising and scandalous that an agency of the federal government treats these fundamental rights with such disdain and pays no attention to the evidence that's presented. I know for the past year there has been serious efforts to bring to attention and to find solutions and to get sort of corrections in what's going on, and yet there still is an obduracy, a resistance, a defiance in many cases from the border agency about what it's doing. And that, to me, says that it now has to be a real issue for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to take a stand and not to allow sort of the autonomy of one agency to bring in what I think is a serious indictment of Canada's record. And it's too bad because I think Canadians generally have one of the few places in the world that supports open immigration. We're one of the places that has in our Charter of Rights one of the most important statements and declaration of those values. And to allow the administrative agency to undermine and go its own pathway. Allan made a good comment about saying one of the reasons is that really there has seeped into so much of our border issues the question of security, that it becomes the overall overarching dominant factor in making decisions. And I think that unfortunately that has been translated into this unmonitored, under-reviewed discretion of individual officers who have virtually no training or particularly sympathy for what's going on. So I think it is certainly time for the government of Canada to change its policy, to abrogate these agreements, to establish proper support for detention facilities when people arrive, and to make sure that our system is capable of processing the detainees and asylum seekers in a fair and effective way. I also think that it's time for probably a shift in paradigm to recast what's happened maybe since 9/11 and really once again base our refugee immigration policy in the Charter of Rights. That was one of the most important decisions that any country has made. And this sort of backsliding that we see is one that doesn't help our reputation. And it certainly is, I think, contrary to where most Canadians stand. And so I would really suggest that this example, as everyone has said to now, needs to be abrogated immediately. I think it would also should lead to a serious review of the human rights of those coming to the border, whether it is through the various streams that we have, to make sure that the fundamental values that were intrinsic to our charter and to the international codes that we abide by or should abide by are properly applied and properly administered. It may be time for a full parliamentary review. It may also be time for the government to initiate that kind of a commission to put to end and to certainly review the lack of oversight, the lack of guidance, and the lack of the overall decision and direction of a government, contrary to the whims, caprices of one particular agency. So I hope that in this launching of a major campaign across Canada to bring attention to the fundamental human rights that we're witnessing being abrogated and transgressed, this is something that all Canadians need to take seriously. And I know as a government that commits itself to human rights, it would be embarrassed to think that this continuation of such a repression of rights continues. So I hope that the campaign that has been launched by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch will be able to provide a very quick and effective conversion to a properly applied procedure that the minister responsible for border agencies exercises discretion and on all these cases from a humanitarian human rights point of view. And then thirdly, as a country, we take another look at just how and where we can improve our standing on the human rights of the strangers who come to our borders with hope and aspiration, and not end up being disillusioned, as we've heard about this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ketty Nivyabandi, and I serve as the Secretary General for Amnesty International Canada, English speaking. Now, you've heard extensively from our esteemed panelists, and I will be brief. As mentioned earlier by my colleague, Sara Muscati, Amnesty International, in collaboration with Human Rights Watch, co-authored a report on immigration detention last year, and both our organizations jointly launched the Welcome to Canada campaign. Canada, as you have heard, previous speakers state both eloquently and persuasively, has incarcerated tens of thousands of people in immigration detention over the past decade, including children and refugee claimants. None were held on criminal charges or convictions. The testimonies that you heard from Abdelrahman and Sara are harrowing. They have no room in a human rights abiding country. Under no circumstances should anyone be treated in a punitive manner for immigration-related reasons, much less detained in facilities used for criminal law enforcement, such as jails, prisons, or police stations. This structural violence is not only abusive, it disproportionately hurts communities of color. Indeed, our joint report reveals that the largest portion of immigration detainees held for 270 days or longer originated from Africa, followed by the Caribbean. Not only do Black people appear to be incarcerated for longer periods, they are also more often detained in provincial jails rather than immigration holding centers. And this too is what systemic racism looks like. Now, fortunately, the verdicts from not one, but 4 different provinces, British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and Alberta, is evidently clear. They want nothing to do with this practice and the serious human rights concerns it presents. So it now falls on the federal government to abolish this abusive, racist, and discriminatory practice. There is growing consensus among provinces that immigration detention in prisons should end across the country, and the federal government must follow suit. We are here today to call on Prime Minister Trudeau to take leadership on this issue. The federal government is at a critical juncture. It can either continue business as usual, or it can seize this opportunity to end this long-standing and appalling practice within the immigration and refugee protection system. 1 year after our report, our call to the Canadian government remains as urgent as ever today. We urge Prime Minister Trudeau to act without delay to abolish the harmful and inhumane practice of immigration detention, and to immediately abolish the use of provincial jails for immigration detention. As Honorable Allan mentioned, this can be done by the stroke of a pen. The time to act is now. Thank you, and we are now happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much for all your remarks. On va passer à la période des questions, starting with the people in your room. So Toronto Star, you can go ahead.
Thank you. Iram Kojo from Toronto Star. My first question is for Mr. Axworthy and Mr. Rock. I was wondering, although you did shortly went into this, I was wondering why this issue is being raised now as opposed to when you were in power as Liberal ministers. I was wondering, were you not in a better position then to make a change?
I'm very happy to begin by saying that had I been aware when I was in office such things were happening, I would of course have objected and done everything I could to stop it. We're speaking here, the report from Amnesty and Human Rights Watch deals with the period after 2011, 2012. I frankly don't know whether the practice took place before that. I think the agency was only created in the early part of this century. But certainly, had we been aware of it and had we been in office, we would have done everything we could to stop it, because it's just fundamentally wrong. And it's as wrong under a Liberal government as it is under a Tory government or an NDP government. The point is, people's rights are being abused in a very important way.
Mr. Axworthy?
I'll just make a further comment, if I might, that the practice, as I understand it, really took launch with the coming of the border agency and powers ascribed to it. I think it was 2011, where the mantra of security became really overarching. Alan's quite right. It was never brought to my attention as foreign minister or as an immigration minister. I think that this is something that has been probably taking place and growing in the last decade, but it's part of a much larger kind of atmosphere right around the world of restrictions, penalties, punitive actions against those who come to borders. And Canada is a leader and has been a leader in trying to contend with that movement, that force. Allowing this practice to continue really undermines whatever statement we make. I'd be very happy to go back and check records, but it certainly was never an issue. And I know, for example, when I was the immigration minister, I made a special point of ensuring that not only with the border, well, there wasn't a border agency, but the immigration officials were subject to ministerial oversight. And as a minister, I had the discretion to overturn decisions being made at the official level for asylum applications.
A follow-up, please. I was also wondering if you have been in touch with the Liberal government since you left power, and if you have reached out to the leadership, have you heard back? If you heard back, what did you hear back?
We've certainly communicated with the offices of the ministers responsible, spoken with their staff and senior officials. And I believe there is a commitment in good faith on the part of the ministers and their staff to do something about this. I think what we're seeing again and again is the intransigence of the Canadian Border Services Agency and the difficulty there is in reining in that powerful organization, which has broad discretion and sometimes it appears a mind of its own. So what we badly need is political leadership. We need effective oversight of this agency so that it doesn't become a rogue agency. And we need decisions made at the highest levels of government, as Lloyd was saying, that it's the government that's running this country, not the agency. Fundamental principles must be respected, and these practices must change.
Okay, we'll just check if there are any questions on Zoom. A reminder to use the raised hand function if ever you do have a question. On va passer aux questions sur Zoom. Si jamais vous avez une question, s'il vous plaît, faites-nous signe avec la fonction main levée. Just leave a few seconds. Okay, seeing there are none, did you have another question?
I was just wondering if Mr. Axworthy would like to answer the question as well.
Very sorry. Mr. Axworthy, did you have a response to the
Sure.
earlier question?
Well, I think Alan put it well. There's no doubt that over the last year or so, we've tried to provide support for this initiative, and certainly have been in touch with people in Ottawa in the ministerial branch. And I agree. I think that there seemed to be a positive response, but they ran into a roadblock. And to me, it really does come down to a question of government and minister making decisions, not an administrative agency, and they had to be part of a broad sort of plan, which I think, in many ways, is beginning to permeate so much of what we do. I mean, I don't want to get into another issue, but I mean, the same kind of restrictive view is being exhibited when it comes to the abrogation of rights that are taking place through the third-party agreement, where we're sending all kinds of refugee claimants back to the United States into the kind of some of the worst kind of detention conditions imaginable, and we shouldn't be doing that. Again, that's contrary to what I think. So I think that's why I suggest that this should be an opening effort to take account of the human rights abuses, and at the same time recheck our commitment under the charter to make sure that the rights of those who come to the border to claim asylum, to claim landing, are guaranteed, and that is something that we can put forward to the rest of the world as an example and a model of how to provide for the large migration. We're in the stage of the world. There's over 100 million people who've now been dispossessed for all kinds of reasons: corruption, crime, COVID, climate change, and that's really puts a lot of pressure on how we manage our border. And I think right now, I don't have a lot of confidence that we're handling it in a Canadian rights-based way, and that's why I think it's time for a review.
Last chance for questions on Zoom. To use the raise hand function if you do have questions. Irem, did you have another question? You're good? Okay, well, seeing there are no more questions, this will end the press conference. Thank you very much for your time, for being here, and wishing you a lovely day. Thank you.